Hey everybody, and welcome to a deep dive that might surprise you a little bit. We're going to be talking about sex, but not in the way you might be thinking. We're not going to be, giving advice or anything like that. Instead, we're going to be looking at the science behind sex, specifically how sexual activity can impact your health. And we're going to be doing a deep dive into 3 recent scientific papers that look at the connection between sex and the immune system, sex in your heart, and even how sex can play a role in cancer risk. So, are you ready to learn some surprising stuff?
It's really fascinating how much we're still learning about this connection, It's really amazing.
Yeah, I mean, when I first started reading these papers, I was like, whoa, this is not what I expected, but let's jump right in. One of the things that really blew my mind was the idea that having sex regularly can actually boost your immune system. It's like a workout for your defenses.
Yeah, it's true. When you think about it, it kind of makes sense. When you're exposed to new antigens from a partner, your body has to work harder to fight them off. So it's like a training ground for your immune system.
So that's why studies are finding that people who have sex regularly tend to have better outcomes when they get sick, like they're less likely to get the flu or even have severe COVID.
Yeah. And one of the key players here is an antibody called SIGA. It's really important for protecting the mucous membranes in your body, like in your nose and throat and even your gut.
Right, those are like the front lines of your immune system.
Exactly.
But here's the thing. Too much of a good thing can actually backfire. The research suggests that having sex too often, like more than a couple of times a week, can actually suppress your immune system.
Yeah, it's all about finding that balance, just like with exercise. You don't want to overdo it.
Makes sense. Now I was really curious about whether this immune boost applies equally to men and women. What did you find in the research?
Well, it turns out there are some differences. Men seem to experience a more consistent immune benefit from sex, regardless of other factors.
Really?
Yeah, but for women, it's a little more complicated. Their immune response seems to be more affected by things like stress and mood.
So like if a woman's feeling really stressed out, having sex might not actually give her immune system that extra boost.
Exactly. It's a good reminder that our mental and emotional health are really intertwined with our physical health.
Okay, so we've talked about sex as a workout for your immune system, but what about your heart? Does all that activity translate to cardiovascular benefits?
It definitely does. Think about what happens when you have sex. Your heart rate goes up, your blood vessels dilate, and after orgasm, your body releases all sorts of hormones that help lower stress hormones.
Okay, but does that actually translate to a lower risk of heart problems?
Well, one study found that men who had sex twice a week had a 45% lower risk of hypertension.
Wow, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah, but it's important to remember that we're talking about enjoyable, consensual sex here. If it's forced or stressful, it's not going to have the same benefits.
Right, consent and pleasure are really important. In fact, I wonder if doctors might one day prescribe a certain amount of sexual activity, like a dose, for heart health.
It's an interesting thought, and it really shows how connected our physical and emotional well-being are.
Okay, let's move on to a topic that's a bit more sensitive, cancer risk. What does the research say about the connection between sex and cancer?
Well, it's a bit of a mixed bag. It really depends on the type of cancer and the person's gender.
Okay, so let's break it down. What about men and prostate cancer?
There's some evidence that frequent ejaculation, whether through sex or masturbation, can actually lower a man's risk of prostate cancer.
Really? How does that work?
Well, one theory is that it helps to flush out potential carcinogens from the prostate.
Interesting. What about women?
Well, for women, the picture is a bit more complicated. Women who have multiple partners actually face a higher risk of certain HPV-related cancers, like cervical cancer.
So it's important for women to be aware of that risk and to take steps to protect themselves, like getting the HPV vaccine.
Absolutely. The HPV vaccine is incredibly effective at preventing the strains of HPV that cause most cervical cancers.
It's a good reminder that prevention is key and that we should all be having open and honest conversations with our healthcare providers about our sexual health.
I completely agree.
Okay, so we've talked about immune function, heart health, and even cancer risk. But let's not forget that sex is supposed to be enjoyable. And guess what? Science confirms that those feel-good vibes have real benefits too.
That's right. Orgasms release a flood of hormones like oxytocin and endorphins, which are basically your body's natural mood boosters and stress relievers.
It's like your own personal happy hour.
Haha, exactly.
And there's even some evidence that these hormones might contribute to brain health.
That's an area of ongoing research, but the initial findings are pretty exciting.
One study we looked at found that sexually active people who also have diverse social networks tend to live longer.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think it suggests that the benefits of sex, go beyond just the physical. It's about feeling connected, both physically and emotionally.
Yeah, that makes sense. Feeling connected to others is essential for our well-being.
Absolutely. And a healthy sex life can definitely contribute to that.
It can.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground already, but there's still so much more to explore, like the evolutionary perspective on why we even have sex in the first place, and what that can tell us about its impact on our health.
That's a really fascinating topic.
It is. So let's dive into that after a quick break. We'll be right back with more fascinating insights on the deep dive.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we're back. And before the break, we were starting to get into the evolutionary side of things, like why do we even have sex in the first place? Beyond just making babies. It seems like these papers suggest there might be some other evolutionary advantages going on.
Yeah, that's a really interesting area of research. One of the papers we looked at talked about the idea of immune training, like how being exposed to different antigens from multiple partners could actually make our immune system stronger.
Oh yeah, that was fascinating. So basically, our ancestors who had more sexual partners were more likely to be exposed to a wider variety of germs, and therefore more likely to develop immunity, which would have given them a survival advantage.
Exactly. It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective.
But of course, we're talking about a very different environment than the one we live in today.
Right. Our ancestors were living in close-knit communities where they would have been exposed to a lot more pathogens.
So it's not like we should all go out and have a ton of sexual partners in the name of boosting our immune systems.
Definitely not. We have modern medicine and hygiene practices for that.
But it's still fascinating to think about how our evolutionary past might be shaping our behavior today.
It is.
Now, speaking of differences between the past and present, one thing that stood out to me in these papers was the discussion of gender differences. We touched on this a bit earlier with the immune system, but it seems like these differences come up again and again.
Yeah, you're right. It really highlights the need to look at how sex impacts men and women differently.
For example, when it comes to cardiovascular benefits, it seems like both men and women experience those benefits, but maybe for different reasons.
Yeah, that's what the research suggests. For men, some of the cardiovascular benefits seem to be linked to testosterone levels, and frequent ejaculation might help to maintain healthy testosterone levels.
So guys, there's another reason to prioritize a healthy sex life.
Uh-huh, right.
But for women, it seems like the emotional context of sex is even more important for those cardiovascular benefits to kick in.
Yeah, if a woman is feeling stressed or pressured during sex, it can actually negate those positive effects on her blood pressure and heart rate.
That makes sense. It really underscores the importance of communication and making sure that both partners feel safe and comfortable.
Absolutely.
It's a good reminder that our physical and emotional health are really interconnected.
They are.
Okay, let's shift gears back to cancer for a minute. We talked about how frequent ejaculation might protect men from prostate cancer.
Right.
But then we talked about how the opposite seems to be true for women, and certain types of cancer.
Yeah. The relationship between sexual activity and cancer risk in women is definitely more complex.
So for example, women who have multiple partners have a higher risk of developing certain HPV-related cancers,
Right. Like cervical cancer.
which is why it's so important for women to get the HPV vaccine.
Absolutely. The HPV vaccine is incredibly effective at preventing the types of HPV that cause most cervical cancers.
It's a good reminder that, even though we're talking about all these potential benefits of sex, it's still really important to be aware of the risks and to take steps to protect ourselves.
I agree. It's all about being informed and making healthy choices.
Right. And it's also important to remember that the research on this topic is still evolving,
Yeah, there's still a lot we don't know.
so we should always be open to new information.
Definitely.
One thing that I found really interesting in these papers was how much they emphasized the importance of the emotional and mental aspects of sex.
Oh, yeah. That's a crucial part of the conversation.
I mean, we all know that sex can feel good, but I don't think we always talk about how those feel-good vibes can actually have a positive impact on our mental health.
Right. Like we were saying earlier, orgasms release all sorts of hormones like oxytocin and endorphins.
And those hormones don't just make us feel good in the moment. They can actually have longer-term effects on our mood and stress levels.
Yeah. There's even some evidence that they might play a role in reducing anxiety and depression.
Wow, that's pretty amazing.
It is.
So it's not just about the physical act itself, it's about feeling good about the experience.
Exactly. It's about feeling safe and connected and desired.
And that can have a ripple effect on our overall well-being.
It can.
Now, I'm curious, what about the people for whom sex isn't always a positive or enjoyable experience? Like people who have experienced sexual trauma or have other challenges related to their sexuality.
That's a really important point. Sexual health is a very broad spectrum, and for some people, sex can be associated with pain or trauma or other difficulties.
Right. And it's important for those people to know that they're not alone,
Absolutely. And that there is help available.
like therapy or counseling,
Yeah. There are therapists who specialize in sexual health.
and there's no shame in seeking help.
None at all.
It's a sign of strength and self-care.
I agree.
Okay. So we've talked about the physical benefits of sex, the emotional and mental benefits, and even the evolutionary and societal influences. But there's one more really important aspect of sexual health that we need to address, and that's safety.
Right.
I mean, we can't talk about all these potential benefits without also acknowledging the risks.
And one of the biggest risks is sexually transmitted infections.
Exactly. STIs are incredibly common, and anyone who is sexually active can be at risk,
That's why it's so important to be informed and to take precautions.
like using condoms.
Yes, condoms are very effective at reducing the risk of transmission.
And it's also really important to get tested regularly.
Absolutely. Knowing your status is essential for protecting your health.
And the health of your partners.
Right.
And if you do happen to contract an STI,
Don't panic.
there's no shame in it.
It's a common health issue.
And the most important thing is to get treated.
Exactly. Most STIs are treatable.
And many are preventable.
So let's recap the key points about sexual health and safety. Open communication with your partner, use barrier methods like condoms, get tested regularly, and seek medical attention if you need it.
Okay. So we've covered a lot of ground today, but I feel like we've only just scratched the surface.
Yeah, it's a really complex and fascinating topic.
But I think the main takeaway is that sexual health is an integral part of our overall health and well-being.
I agree.
It's not just about physical pleasure or reproduction. It's about embracing our sexuality in a way that feels positive and fulfilling and safe.
And it's about being informed and making choices that are right for us.
Exactly. And if anyone listening has any concerns or questions, don't hesitate to reach out to a healthcare professional.
They can provide personalized advice and support.
Okay. Well, on that note, I think it's time to move on to our final segment, where we'll be exploring the psychological impact of sex in even more depth.
Sounds good.
Okay, so we've talked about how sex can boost your immune system and how it can be good for your heart. But what about the impact on our mental and emotional health? It seems like there's a lot more to the story than just those feel-good hormones.
Yeah, there is. You know those hormones we talked about, oxytocin and endorphins? Well, they do more than just make us feel good in the moment. They actually contribute to feelings of bonding. And they can reduce stress and potentially even change how we perceive stress in general.
Oh, wow. So it's not just about feeling good during sex. It's about feeling good afterwards, too.
Exactly.
And I think that's something that we don't always talk about.
Yeah, we tend to focus on the physical aspects of sex, but the psychological and emotional aspects are just as important.
If not more important.
Right.
So what does the research say about the link between sexual activity and mental well-being?
Well, one study found that people who had sex frequently reported feeling less stressed overall.
That makes sense.
Yeah, and there's other research that shows a connection between sexual satisfaction and overall happiness.
So it's not just about having sex, it's about having good sex.
Exactly, and that means feeling safe and respected and desired by your partner.
Right, it's about feeling good about the experience.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the feel-good hormones, and we've talked about the importance of feeling safe and connected. But there was one finding that really surprised me, the idea that sex might actually have cognitive benefits.
Oh, yeah.
Is there any truth to the saying that sex makes you smarter?
Well, it's not quite that simple, but there is some research that suggests that sexual activity, particularly when it involves exploring new experiences, might actually stimulate neuroplasticity in the brain.
Wait, really?
Yeah. Some studies have shown that people who engage in novel sexual experiences have increased gray matter density in certain areas of the brain.
Like which areas?
Well, one area is the prefrontal cortex, which is involved in decision-making and emotional regulation and all those higher-level executive functions.
Wow. So keeping things fresh in the bedroom might actually be good for your brain.
It's a possibility, but we need more research to confirm these findings.
Okay, so we've talked about a lot of positive things about sex, but I think it's important to acknowledge that for some people, sex isn't always a positive or enjoyable experience.
Right.
Like people who have experienced trauma or have other challenges related to their sexuality.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
And I don't want anyone listening to feel like we're not acknowledging those experiences.
Yeah. Sexual health encompasses a wide range of experiences, and for some people, sex can be associated with pain or trauma or other difficulties.
And it's important for those people to know that they're not alone.
Absolutely. And that there is help available.
Like therapy or counseling.
Exactly. There are therapists who specialize in sexual health.
And there's no shame in seeking help.
Not at all.
It's a sign of strength and self-care.
Right.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, I think the biggest takeaway is that sexual health is a really important part of our overall health and well-being.
I agree.
And it's something that we should all be talking about more openly and honestly.
Definitely.
We need to move beyond the stigma and the shame.
Yes.
And start embracing our sexuality in a way that feels healthy and positive and fulfilling.
Absolutely.
And if anyone listening has any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate to reach out to a healthcare professional.
They can provide personalized advice and support.
And remember, you are not alone.
You are not.
Well, that's it for this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.